Good morning. We're coming close to the end of our series in the Gospel of Matthew. We're in Matthew chapter 27 this morning. If you would open your Bibles and follow along, Matthew 27. And we'll be picking up in verse 16. Excuse me, not verse 16, verse 27. Having a little bit of dyslexia there. We've seen Jesus put on trial. Though he has not committed any sin, though he has done nothing that is worthy of death, he has still been condemned. The mob has shouted, "Crucify, crucify him," even though Jesus did nothing wrong. And at any time, as we've just sung about, Jesus could have called 12 legions of angels, and yet he remained silent. And actually, I said last week that 10,000 angels is technically an understatement, because a legion consisted of 6,000 soldiers. So 12 legions of angels would be 72,000 angels. The song, I guess, understates it because it's hard to get 72,000 into something that sounds poetically or rhythmically correct. But Jesus could have done that. It really doesn't matter how many angels Jesus could have called, because frankly, one angel could have dealt with this situation single-handedly. And in fact, Jesus himself, I think, could have dealt with this situation single-handedly. He is the Son of God. He created the world. He created all of those people who were shouting, "Crucify him." He could have destroyed them with just as little effort as it took him to create them. In this account of the death of Jesus, we see the extreme limits of everybody. We see the limits of human sin, of cruelty, and of unrighteousness. We see the epitome of shame, of unfairness, of injustice. We see the hyperbole of God's grace, mercy, and love. Jesus is before Pilate, on trial, and though they can't really level any charges against him that'll stick, Pilate nevertheless hands him over to be crucified. He releases Barabbas, the insurrectionist, for them, but after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. In verse 27, it says, "The soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand. And when they knelt down before him and mocked him, saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' They spat on him and took the reed and began to beat him on the head. And after they had mocked him, they took the scarlet robe off him and put his own garments back on him and led him away to crucify him." Why do they do this? And the Roman soldiers pull this one off. The only accusation that the Jewish people had against Jesus was the fact that he was their king, the king of the Jews, which I guess they were twisting that to make him out to be some kind of insurrectionist. "We have no king but Caesar's," they say in the Gospel of John. Pilate asks Jesus in verse 11 of chapter 27, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "It is as you say." Now Jesus will be crucified at the behest of a mob that says, "His blood be on us and on our children." Verse 25. And it was customary for the Romans to scourge criminals before crucifying them. But here the Romans are not sympathetic to Jesus at all. They are fully aware that they have been handed an innocent man, and yet they do not see it as some great travesty or some great injustice. They see it as an opportunity for comedy and parody. Make a mockery of Jesus. This was not the isolated behavior of one or two Roman guards. This was the Roman cohort, the whole Roman cohort that was gathered around Jesus doing this to him. And in case you don't know what a cohort is, a cohort consisted of about 600 soldiers, at least. This great mob of Roman soldiers drags Jesus into the courtyard, and they make sport of him. They beat him. They dress him up as their parody king. A scarlet robe, a crown of thorns. He gets a reed for a scepter. And they mockingly say, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And then they take his scepter, quote unquote, and they beat him with it. Because to the Romans, the charge leveled against Jesus was a joke. This whole situation is a joke. A Jewish political absurdity. That's what this is to these people. And instead of siding with the innocent man, instead of trying to defend him or stand up for him, they treat it like the joke they perceive it as. The king, quote unquote, that was supposed to come and overthrow the Romans, the king that was supposed to set up their great geopolitical empire, that king is being mocked and beaten by those same Romans who he was supposedly supposed to overthrow. But of course you and I know better than that. You and I know that Jesus' goal was never to defeat just the Romans. Jesus' goal was to defeat Satan and sin. And after they've had their fun, they strip him down and they lead him away in verse 31 to crucifixion. What was crucifixion? I don't think we appreciate what Jesus was going through because we don't live in that culture. You won't drive down I-275 and see people hanging on crosses and being crucified by the side of the road because nobody does that in our society anymore. It's considered barbaric. Actually, almost any form of capital punishment is being considered barbaric these days. But that's another discussion. Crucifixion was invented by the Greeks, but perfected by the Romans. It's related to the Latin verb for torture because it was designed to be the most excruciatingly painful and shameful form of death available. The victim was nailed to the cross, and there's some argument about whether they were nailed through the wrists or through the palms. I think that's a silly thing to argue about because frankly, you die either way. The victim was nailed through the feet, and there's some argument again about how the feet were nailed on there. Just that they were nailed on there, we know. The cross, probably shaped like a T. The victim was only a few feet off the ground. It was about 8 feet high, which I guess as high up as they come would be about as high up as I'm standing on this stage right about now. These pictures that you get in artists of these 20-foot high crosses are probably not, a little exaggerated, I think. There was a sign placed over the victim's head that specified the crime that he had committed to deserve crucifixion. And that was just a thing that they did as well. And the Romans didn't have any gripes about modesty. These victims were crucified naked. Their clothes were taken by the Roman guards and divvied up among them. Sometimes the victim was offered a mild analgesic of wine and myrrh mixed together. Jesus particularly refuses that drink on this occasion. It usually took victims who were crucified several days to die. A person who was in pretty good health could go on the cross as long as he could without food and water. And even then, a passerby might feed them or something like that. But Jesus is an unusual case. Jesus is dead within 6 hours, as we're going to see in this story. Death usually occurred by asphyxiation. You're hanging there. The hardest thing it is for you to do is exhale because you basically have to pull yourself up. How many pull-ups can you do? That's basically what you have to do, is you're constantly pulling up in order to breathe out. Because there was difficulty in exhaling, speaking would be particularly difficult for people that were hanged on crosses. And so you note that all of Jesus' statements that he makes on the cross are relatively short. Sometimes you'll read, again, these artists' imaginative descriptions of these long discourses that Jesus gives from the cross. There's probably not much historicity to that, and that's not in the Bible anyway. If they needed to save time and kill the victims a little quicker, they would break their legs to hasten the suffocation process. Now, I say all this to put the picture in your mind. And when we think of the cross, what are we thinking of? Well, we're thinking of pain. Excruciating, torturous pain. That wasn't what they thought first when you said the word cross in their culture. Whenever they thought of the cross, they thought of shame. Because as decadent as the Greco-Roman society was, as much immorality and disgusting behavior as the Greco-Romans tolerated, there was a high level of honor and dishonor. It was all about where you were on the social ladder. And if you were crucified, well, that was the worst way to go out of this world. Because it's humiliating. Because the body is left in full exposure for everybody on the highway to see. Naked until it is completely, usually left on the cross until it's devoured by vultures. Now, again, Jesus is an obvious exception to that because Jesus wasn't eaten by vultures. He was actually given a proper burial in the grave of a rich man. But that's what crucifixion was. When we talk about crucifixion, we are talking about shame. It is, as the song we sang said, it is the emblem of suffering and shame. And so when Paul said, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, understand what he is really saying is, I am not ashamed that my God came down and allowed himself to be beaten, scourged, and shamefully displayed naked for all the world to see while he suffered and suffocated to death. That's what he's not ashamed of. And when Jesus talks about people being ashamed of him versus being proud of him, confessing him before men, understand that there was a very good reason in their day to be shameful. Understand that when Paul said, let he who boasts boast in the Lord, let God forbid that I should boast save in the death of Jesus my Lord, through whom I am crucified to the world and the world is crucified to me. Is that something to boast about to you? That's what God allows to happen to himself. Pick up in verse 32. As they were coming out, they found a man of Cyrene named Simon, whom they pressed into service to bear his cross. When they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they gave him wine to drink mixed with gall, and after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink. When they had crucified him and divided up his garments among themselves by casting lots, and sitting down, they began to keep watch over him there. Above his head, they put up the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." At that time, 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. Those passing by were hurling abuse at him, wagging their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes and elders, were mocking him and saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him now come down from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now, if he delights in him, for he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" The robbers who had been crucified with him were also insulting him with the same words. Now from the 6th hour, darkness fell upon the land until the 9th hour. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani?" That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And some of those who were standing there when they heard it began saying, "This man is calling for Elijah." Immediately one of them ran, and taking a sponge, he filled it with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave him a drink. But the rest of them said, "Let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. Coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. The centurion and those who were with him, keeping guard over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake and the things that were happening, became very frightened and said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Simon was recruited to carry his cross. Normally, a crucified victim would carry his own cross, but on this occasion, apparently Jesus was not fit to do that. He was crucified at Golgotha. In other Gospels, it's sometimes called Calvary. It means the place of the skull. It's not a happy place. Jesus refuses to drink the wine and the gall that they give him together. He refuses to take the analgesic that was sometimes given to these victims. The soldiers divvy up his garments, just like we said. He has a charge over his head, but because they couldn't really find a legitimate charge to level against Jesus, what did they say? This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. They put 2 thieves on either side of him. Common criminals. Because that's what this is. Jesus is just another common criminal to these people. Hung on the cross, hung out to die. I can't help but reflect with irony on the request that James and John made in chapter 20. Whenever they asked if Jesus would allow them to be seated at his right hand and at his left hand. Well, here in the Gospel of Matthew, the only people seated at Jesus' right hand and left hand are the 2 thieves on the 2 crosses next to him. They really didn't know what they were asking for. But Matthew does not really sensationalize the pain aspect of this. He puts a lot of space, he devotes a lot of words in this passage to the mockery that is made of Jesus on this occasion. Come down from the cross! Save yourself! Oh, he saved others, but he can't save himself. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he delights in him. That last one is actually a quote from Psalm 22 and verse 8. Although I'm not sure they realized that they were quoting the psalm, as we're going to see in a moment. Even the robbers, the thieves, are hurling abuse at Jesus. Now the Gospel of Luke mentions that one of these robbers at some point comes to his senses and actually sides with Jesus and says this man has done nothing wrong. That's unique to Luke. How would you have responded to this mockery? Well, I know what I would have done. If I were an innocent man being crucified, and people were saying this kind of stuff, oh, I probably would have come up with some kind of verbal tongue lashing to throw at them. I would have gotten back at them in some way. But if I actually had the power that Jesus had, well, I would have come down from the cross all right. As people wouldn't know, I would have come down at that point and forget summoning legions of angels, I'll destroy them myself. Jesus could have done that. That's the thing that's so remarkable about all of this. Jesus could have come down from the cross, like any of us would be inclined to do, at the unfairness and the upside-down nature of this situation, and yet Jesus behaves just as he does throughout the trials. He's silent. He does not open his mouth. Chapter 26, verse 63. Chapter 27, verses 12 through 14. He does not answer the charges leveled against him even now. It is as the Apostle Peter wrote in 1 Peter chapter 2, in verses 21 through 25. You have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to the one who judges righteously. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by his wounds you were healed, where you were continually straying like sheep. But now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. Why would Jesus do that? Why didn't he revile? Why didn't he insult? Why didn't he threaten? Why didn't he come down from the cross? There's a lot of questions we don't know the answer to in life. A lot of things that, we're not really privy to. We look around the world around us, we see human suffering, we see conflicts, we see difficulties, we see lots of reasons to be discouraged. And we don't know why God allows sick people to die. We don't know why God allows children to die. But somehow, in some way, we know this about God, that He loves us. And we know that He loves us because He proved it, because He didn't come down from the cross. What was it that was holding Jesus to the cross? Well, it wasn't the nails. I can tell you that right now. Those nails were not standing in His way. It wasn't the wood on the cross itself. It wasn't as if they had used duct tape or super glue or staple guns or whatever. None of those things were holding Jesus on the cross. It was the love that He had for us, ultimately, is why He didn't come down from the cross. Because we know that God loves us, we have so much hope for the future. Jesus' death is particularly remarkable. At the 6th hour, it becomes dark. And just to give you a translation of their time, that's noon. It just became dark at noon. It stays dark until about 3 o'clock. And at 3 o'clock, Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, this is the only time in the New Testament where Jesus quotes from the Old Testament, and we're given the quote in Aramaic, and then it's translated for us. Mark does the same thing. And this quote is clearly the opening line of the 22nd Psalm. Psalm 22 is one of those psalms that you read it and it's clearly not predicting anything. It's the psalmist talking about his suffering. But listen to how similar some of this sounds. Beginning in verse 1. My God, why have you forsaken me? Far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning. Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I have no rest. Yet you are holy, O you who are enthroned upon the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were delivered. In you they trusted and were not disappointed. But I am a worm, not a man. Reproach of men, despised by the people. All who see me sneer at me. They separate with the lip. They wag the head, saying, commit yourself to the Lord. Let Him deliver him. Let Him rescue him, because He delights in him. Yet you are He who brought me forth from the womb. You made me trust when upon my mother's breasts. Upon you I was cast from birth. You have been my God from my mother's womb. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help. Many bulls have surrounded me. Strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. They open wide their mouth at me as a ravening and a roaring lion. I am poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd. My tongue cleaves to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. For dogs have surrounded me. A band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They look. They stare at me. They divide my garments among them. And for my clothing they cast lots. David wrote that. But doesn't it sound like Jesus? Like what we're seeing right there in Matthew 27? Sounds a lot like the kind of thing that Jesus is going through. And Jesus' quote from this psalm is not the only connection that this psalm has to the scene. There's the obvious stuff like the piercing of the hands of the feet, the garments being divided, the thirst, my tongue cleaves to the roof of my mouth. He's surrounded by evildoers and they mock him. And even verse 8 is quoted by the enemies of Jesus. Oh, let him trust the Lord because he delights in him. This many connections begs the question of how we should interpret Jesus' quote from Psalm 22. And there's a common view out there that there's some kind of mysterious or mystical separation, quote unquote, between the Father and the Son on the cross. I find this to be fanciful speculation because the Bible doesn't really say one way or another. And if something like that was happening, well, then it would be beyond our comprehension. Because the only objective evidence we have to interpret the statement of Jesus on the cross is what it says in the psalm itself. And the psalm does not end with the suffering. The psalm is about a righteous sufferer who appears to have been forsaken by God, who feels forsaken by God, and yet it is only the appearance, because God does deliver. In verse 19 he says, "You, O Lord, be not far off. O you, my help, hasten to my assistance. Deliver my soul from the sword, my only life from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth, from the horns of the wild oxen you answer me. I will tell of your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise Him. All you descendants of Jacob, glorify Him. Stand in awe of Him, all you descendants of Israel, for He has not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, nor has He hidden His face from him. But when he cried to Him for help, He heard. From you comes my praise in the great assembly. I shall pay my vows before those who fear Him. The afflicted will eat and be satisfied. Those who seek Him will praise the Lord. Let your heart live forever. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord. All the families of the nations will worship before you, for the kingdom is the Lord's. He rules over the nations. All the prosperous of the earth will eat and worship. All those who go down to the dust will bow before Him, even he who cannot keep his soul alive. Posterity will serve Him. It will be told of the Lord to the coming generation. They will come and will declare His righteousness to a people who will be born that He has performed it. At some point you got to go, is this the same psalm? Well, it is. This is the psalm that began with, my God, why have you forsaken me? But it ends in such a way that there is great praise for God. That the kingdom is the Lord's. This is how the kingdom will be established. It's through the righteous sufferer. Now Jesus doesn't quote the whole psalm, because on the cross exhaling would be something that, as I said before, is difficult. And it seems readily apparent to me that Jesus quotes the psalm to draw a connection between what is going on and what David wrote long before he did. But I would say furthermore that the main point of the psalm is not the suffering and the forsakenness, but the fact that God ultimately does not forsake His people. The point of the psalm is in verse 24, not verse 1. He has not despised the affliction of the afflicted. In Jesus' case, his real point seems to be the same as the psalmist, that the man who appears to be forsaken by God, rejected by humanity, is ultimately the man who God will vindicate. And in Jesus' case, he is vindicated fully by God by being raised from the dead. Our lives are the same way. Have you ever felt forsaken by God? Of course you have. If you've not felt forsaken by God, I suspect that you've probably not lived long enough. Or you haven't been paying attention. Jesus is surrounded by enemies, and it appears that God has abandoned him, because God doesn't send those legions of angels to save him. God doesn't jump into the scene and kick everybody out. Instead, what happens? Well, Jesus dies. He's killed by these people. It's the same thing with us. You know, Christianity has a lot of enemies. What's the worst they can do to you? Make fun of you? Mock you? Think little of you? Persecute you? Kill you? In the end, so what? Even if we are killed in the body, God will raise us from the dead. That is what we can take trust and assurance in. Now, Jesus' quote is obviously subject to misinterpretation, because the people surrounding the cross think he's calling for Elijah. They offer Jesus sour wine, and Jesus gives up his last breath. And in that moment, when Jesus dies, we see a series of cosmic events happen one at a time. In the temple there was a veil that separated the holy place from the most holy place. And nobody could enter the most holy place except the high priest once a year. Because that's where God dwelled. And the veil was supposed to separate between God and man. In that moment when Jesus died, the veil is torn. Because the separation is ended. The earth is split by an earthquake. And as a foreshadowing of the resurrections that are about to happen, graves are open, dead bodies come to life, a very literal fulfillment of Ezekiel 37, where the dry bones become flesh. That last bit's a remarkable event, and it's unique to Matthew, is the strangest thing about it. But that's a living illustration of what's going to happen when the gospel begins. The preaching of the gospel. Because you think about it, that's where true life comes from. It's through the death of Jesus Christ. And the centurion who's standing on the scene, the Roman soldier who was involved in this process, realizes this must have been the Son of God. Surely this was the Son of God. In verse 55, many women were looking on from a distance who had followed Jesus from Galilee while ministering to him. Among them was Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Joseph, the mother of the sons of Zebedee. And when it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out in the rock, and he rolled a large stone against the entrance of the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene was there, the other Mary, sitting opposite the grave. On the next day, the day after the preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I am to rise again.' Therefore give orders for the grave to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal him away and say to the people, 'He's risen from the dead.' And the last deception will be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard. Go, make it as secure as you know how." And they went and made the grave secure. Along with the guard, they set a seal on the stone. Now, the burial of Jesus is basically what we have here is a rich man, Joseph of Arimathea, buries the body. Jesus' body couldn't be left on a tree because those who hang on a tree are accursed by God. It says that in the law in Deuteronomy chapter 21 in verses 22 and 23. There's also the issue of the Sabbath and the Passover to consider. They bury him in the tomb, they block the door to the tomb with a large stone, and then Matthew includes a detail that the other Gospels do not. He mentions that a guard is left at the tomb. Unique to Matthew, in order to ensure that the disciples do not steal the body and they do not try to fabricate some kind of resurrection story. They apparently paid closer attention to Jesus' predictions than the disciples actually did. Because there's no indication that the disciples were conspiring to do this. They appear to have been driven by fear. They appear to have given up hope. Pilate gives them a guard. They seal the stone. There's no way this body's coming out. Or is there? It anticipates what happens next. Jesus is raised from the dead. Now specifically, what happens with the resurrection, we're going to talk about that not next week. I have another sermon planned for next week. But the following week. But just to conclude an observation here, Matthew's account of the crucifixion is not sensational. He doesn't try to shock us with gory details. But he does try very hard to show us how Jesus' enemies are behaving on this occasion. The mockery he endures, the shame he endures, and all the while hanging in the background this thought that Jesus could summon an army of angels at any point if he wanted to. to end this thing right now. We see the extreme limits of everyone. We see the limits of human sin, cruelty, and unrighteousness. We see the epitome of shame, unfairness, and injustice. We see the hyperbole of God's grace, mercy, and love. You all have a choice to make. Every one of us has a choice to make in our lives. We can either reject His death as just another obscure injustice on the pages of human history, or we can realize that His death is unique. It is, in fact, the central event of human history. It is the only way that we obtain true life. And if so, we ought to conform ourselves to the same selfless, submissive, sacrificial, suffering service. If you're here this morning, if you are not a Christian, you can be immersed in water to come into contact with the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. If you are a Christian, but you realize you have not been living the life of suffering service that Christianity so demands, well, we can help you make that right too. If there's anything we can do for you, let it be known. Let's stand and sing together.